Objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of subcommittee at any time. Without objection, members of the full committee, not members of this subcommittee, are authorized to participate in today's hearings. This is the last subcommittee hearing that I will chair for at least 2 years. I look forward to working with the Republican side next year. So our last hearing is titled ESGW, Examining Private Sector Disclosures and Workforce Management, Investment, and Diversity Data. And this is a chance for us to look not only at ESG, but W, workforce. I now recognize myself for 4 minutes. During today's hearing, we'll examine a number of important issues regarding the information that is disclosed to investors. While a number of critical topics come in the areas of ESG, environmental, social, and governance, and they will be discussed here, we'll also have a chance to look at workforce. The lifeblood of any organization is its workforce, and it's something that investors are concerned with. Since 1998, the European Union has required a report on human capital investment in relation to salaries, bonuses, other benefits, but these disclosures are not required in the United States, and only 15% of the S&P 500 even attempt to make these disclosures. And of course, there aren't official standards for defining the terms, determining what is disclosed, tabulating the information, assuring the internal control of that tabulation, or auditing it. Meanwhile, the U.S. economy has changed dramatically since accounting standards were designed. It's not all on the balance sheet anymore. Back in my day, or before my day, if you wanted to look at the book value of a company, you looked at the balance sheet. Well, they got a plant, they got a factory, they got some land. That's their book value. Maybe they're worth 10% more than that. Today, according to the Working Group on Human Capital Accounting Disclosure, while in 1975 intangibles represented 17% of the value of this S&P 500 company, today it's 90%. So 90% of the value of what investors are looking at isn't on the balance sheet. It's time to have a statement that at least gives them investors information about what is the most valuable asset, not on the balance sheet, of most corporations, and that is their workforce. For over 5 years, a group of 26 institutional investors representing $3 trillion in assets have petitioned the SEC for a framework for disclosing information on human capital. In August of 2020, the SEC, under the leadership of Jay Clayton, appointed by Donald Trump, adopted amendments to Regulation XK to require public companies to include a description of human capital resources, but not in the kind of form that those familiar with balance sheets and income statements would recognize. So, again, we need to define the terms so that it's parallel from one company to another and understood by investors. We need to determine how that information is going to be presented. Second, we need to tabulate the information and do so in a method that has internal control so that we can rely on the tabulation. And finally, we need to audit both adherence to the definitions, the tabulation practices, and the internal control system that leads to that tabulation. We do that for what is now the small part of the balance sheet, the stuff we put on the balance sheet, and we need to give investors information about workforce. We will also today look at the environmental and greenhouse gas issues, and I know our witnesses, most of them are prepared to discuss that as well. With regard to environmental disclosures, Scope 1 and Scope 2 being proposed by the SEC, I think make a lot of sense. It is going to be hard to go into Scope 3, and that may be a bridge too far. It may give us effects way beyond what we are trying to achieve. So I look forward to learning more about how we can disclose turnover rates, investment in workforce, and workforce diversity. And we think we have outstanding witnesses that will help us do that. With now, I recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Sherman, and I appreciate the witnesses being here in your testimony this morning. Frankly, I'd be lying if I said I was surprised by today's hearing topic. Sadly, today's hearing isn't about investor protection, entrepreneurship, or capital markets. It's about the majority's latest attempt to legitimize the last 4 years of failed policy, most of that coming out of the SEC. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, for American small businesses, Democrats have been unable to legislate their climate and social policies. Instead, they've relied on unelected regulators and bureaucrats to carry out that agenda. And you don't have to go far to see this playing out. The Securities and Exchange Commission's pending climate disclosure rule is a primary example of overburdensome regulation done by administrative overreach, requiring the SEC to establish mandatory disclosures on issues outside their expertise would surely result in a complicated and confusing disclosure regime, especially to the extent that information is not material for the company. That is the watchword, materiality. But let's for a second focus on the topics at hand, ESG, and for this hearing, Democrat majority added W, which supposedly stands for workforce. I would say, just like to put forward, maybe it stands for woke. Specifically, I want to key in on corporate governance, which refers to an organization is managed and how leadership performs and how stakeholder expectations are met. I am also disappointed, frankly, that this committee, and I have to take this moment to say that the committee has not fulfilled its duty, not to mention its pledges to me and others on this committee and in the public, to have Chair Gensler in front of this subcommittee or the full committee. It has been over a year since he has appeared. But under Chair Gensler, the SEC has experienced several operational problems that have eroded public trust in the Commission, preventing it from carrying out its statutory mandate. Instead of meeting those stakeholder expectations, the agency is focused on pushing a far-left liberal agenda that aims to impact every aspect of our capital markets. Now, according to an October of 22 Inspector General report, staff attrition at the SEC is at its highest rate in over a decade. Not only does this diminish the SEC's ability to protect investors and ensure adequate capital formation, it reduces the quality of the SEC rulemaking being proposed, which is being outsourced to temporary and inexperienced staff. Coupled with consistent short comment periods, a technical error that disrupted the public comment process, and a complete lack of proposals that will facilitate capital formation, one would have to give the SEC low marks for their corporate governance and workplace management. Lastly, I'd like to provide some commentary on the issue that has been front and center and frankly has caused a lot of confusion and concern amongst marketplace participants. This summer, Chair Gensler gave remarks in which he said, quote, "Retail investors have greater access to markets than at any time in the past," close quote, but left open the possibility of promulgating a rule on equity market structure reform, which we learned yesterday will be added to the other 30 rule proposals that he has given in the last 11 months. So that's going to be released next week. Retail participation in U.S. markets has grown across every demographic, and today, self-directed retail investors make up a significant portion of daily activity on our markets. The current state of equity markets is the product of years of private sector innovation and prudent, fact-based, and data-driven public sector rulemaking. One of the SEC's chief mission objectives is to maintain fair and orderly and efficient markets, which is something that I wholeheartedly support. Yet, however, market reform should be developed transparently with input from affected stakeholders and with evidence that the proposed changes will achieve the intended goal. We have yet to be given that evidence. And without objection, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit a letter for the record to Chair Gensler from myself and Mr. Gottheimer on market structure reform outlining our concerns.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, Republicans on this committee have warned our Democrat colleagues time and time again that there would become a day when they couldn't protect this administration any longer. Fortunately for small businesses and investors, that day is coming. I look forward to hearing from many of the officials who have ignored these warnings and frankly ducked congressional oversight. That's not going to happen. and it's certainly not going to happen anymore. I look forward to working with all of my colleagues on this subcommittee and achieve our shared objectives of making sure we protect the investors, have fair and orderly markets, and create market opportunity and capital formation. That's our real goal and objective. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize the chair of the full committee for 1 minute.
Thank you for holding this important hearing, Chair Sherman, and for your strong focus on investor protection throughout your tenure as chair of the subcommittee. Environmental sustainability and governance metrics, which include human capital disclosures, are increasingly important to investors. Earlier this Congress, the House passed Mr. Vargas's H.R. 1187, the Corporate Governance Improvement and Investor Protection Act, which would reform the disclosure regime for the public companies by requiring, standardizing the reporting of several important ESG metrics being discussed today. The SEC heard this body loud and clear, and it moved forward on a disclosure agenda that responds to the needs of our nation's investors and workers. So I look forward to hearing the testimony today as we look to inform the SEC of its work ahead. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. I want to thank the witnesses, not only for being here today, especially today, because we'd scheduled this hearing 2 days ago, and then on the floor we had a series of 12 votes. They rearranged their schedule, and we appreciate their attendance. We have a panel of distinguished witnesses. First, we're going to have Cambria Allen-Ratzlaff, who is Managing Director and Head of Investor Strategies at Just Capital, and she is particularly focused on the W in today's hearing, workforce. Next, we will have Dr. Colleen Honigsberg, who has a Ph.D. in accounting and is a professor of law at Stanford Law School. I thought I had a good background being a CPA and a graduate of Harvard Law, but a Ph.D. in accounting and a professorship at Stanford shows me how much more I could have tried to achieve. We then have Dr. Shiva Rajgopal, who is a professor of accounting and auditing at Columbia Business School, and he is prepared to talk about both the W and the E, environment and workforce. I should point out that Colleen's Honigsberg is more focused here on the workforce. And without objection, I would like to enter into the record a letter signed by the Working Group on Human Capital Accounting Disclosure, dated June 7th, signed by the last two witnesses I introduced, since that letter is pretty much the reason we're having much of this hearing. We will also have Fran Seegull, who is president of U.S. Impact Investing Alliance, focusing on environmental disclosures, and Andrew Volmir, who is a senior scholar at the Discus Center at George Mason. Witnesses are reminded that their oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes. You will be able to see a timer, which will indicate how much time you have left. I would ask you to be mindful of timers so that you can be respectful of both your fellow witnesses' time and those of the committee members. Without objection, your written statements will be made part of the record. Ms. Allen-Ratzlaff, please proceed for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chair Sherman, Ranking Member Huizenga, and members of the subcommittee. Good morning. My name is Cambria Allen-Ratzlaff, and I'm pleased to appear before you today representing Just Capital, where I am Managing Director and Head of Investor Strategies. I also co-chair the Human Capital Management Coalition, now a group of 37 large investors representing over $8 trillion in assets. Just Capital is an independent, nonprofit research organization dedicated to measuring how America's largest public companies create competitive value for their shareholders while serving their workers, customers, communities, and the environment. Our view is that when companies manage their stakeholder relationships well, shareholders also benefit. Every year, we survey the American public to identify the business issues that matter most to them. We then use publicly available data to quantify performance of the Russell 1000 meeting those priorities. The vast majority of this data is hand-collected by our research team, taking 10,000 to 15,000 hours on average. Once we have reviewed the data and assessed company performance, we build our annual rankings. We also leverage the data we collect to understand how performance translates into investment returns. Our work goes where the voice of the American public takes us. Since 2015, we've engaged more than 160,000 Americans representative of the US adult population. And we've found that Americans are remarkably united in what they want companies to prioritize: workers, wages, and jobs. This holds across every single demographic group. Our thesis is that companies that are better at managing their stakeholder relationships tend to generate more returns for their investors. And we've consistently observed this to be true. For example, if an investor purchased an equally weighted index of the top 100 companies in our rankings, which we refer to as the Just 100, the index would have generated over 6% in excess returns against the Russell 1000 from March 2019. If you were to invest in an index of companies scoring in the top 10% of our worker stakeholder group from the beginning of this year through December 1st, you would have generated an excess 9.29% return. As U.S. public companies are born from and an integral part of American society, it is perhaps unsurprising that what's good for workers is good for investors. Our reporting system, however, has been slow to adapt. Consider this. The only line item data U.S. public companies are required to disclose on their workforce is headcount. This reporting standard was set in 1973 when over 80% of the S&P 500's market cap was property, plant, and equipment. Fast forward 50 years to today, and 90% of the S&P 500 is based on intangible assets. But it's human capital, the collective knowledge, skills, and experiences of the workforce powering economic growth. But as our financial reporting standards have lagged, as the chair noted, this also means that up to 90% of company value may not be reflected in companies' disclosed financials, and investors have taken note. Speaking on behalf of the Human Capital Management Coalition, the coalition has urged financial and accounting standard setters to improve access to workforce data through a balanced approach, where principles-based disclosures are anchored by 4 foundational decision-useful disclosures that apply to all companies. They are the number of full-time, part-time, and contingent or contracted labor directly involved in firm operations, 2, labor costs, 3, turnover, and 4, workforce diversity data sufficient to understand the company's efforts to access and develop new sources of talent, as well as how effective these efforts are. Without this information, investors are flying blind, unable to understand how well a company manages its workforce and how it impacts a company's overall business, risks, and prospects to most efficiently direct their financial capital to its highest value use. Today, even attempting to get this information is excessively time-consuming. When Just Capital assessed workforce disclosure at the 100 largest U.S. employers, it took a team of 2 very skilled data scientists over 130 hours to collect data on a discrete number of human capital metrics or find the data completely unavailable. If a sophisticated research organization like Just Capital or large global institutions with billions of dollars in capital are unable to access decision-useful, comparable, consistent, and reliable workforce data, small retail investors are at even more of a disadvantage. Simply put, companies that are best at harnessing the awesome power of their workforces are also best positioned to generate long-term value for shareholders. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Dr. Honigsberg, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Sherman and Ranking Member Huizenga, for the opportunity to testify before you today. Are you able to hear me okay? Thank you. To give you a sense from my background, as Chairman Sherman had noted, I began my career as a CPA with PricewaterhouseCoopers. While I was there, I became very interested in accounting policy, so I returned to school earning a J.D. from Columbia Law School and a Ph.D. in accounting from Columbia Business School. I'm now a professor of law at Stanford Law School, where I teach classes on securities law, corporate governance, and accounting. My recent scholarship focuses on the empirical study of accounting questions, such as human capital disclosure. This past spring, I was delighted to join forces with my colleague here today, Columbia Business School professor Shiva Rajgopal, along with other esteemed academics, including former SEC commissioners Joe Grunfest and Robert Jackson, to create the Working Group on Human Capital Accounting Disclosure. In June, our group petitioned the SEC to develop rules requiring public companies to disclose sufficient information for investors to assess the extent to which firms invest in their workforce. I want to highlight in my testimony today that prompt action on labor cost disclosures is necessary due to two market trends: the growth of human capital firms and the increasing prominence of net loss firms. First, consistent with the comments of Chairman Sherman in his opening remarks, let's consider the growth of the so-called human capital firm in the 21st century. An increasing proportion of public companies derive much of their value from intangible assets, yet only about 15% of those firms even disclose information as basic as total labor costs. As the chairman noted, in 1975, intangibles represented 17% of the value of firms in the S&P 500. By 2020, intangibles represented 90% of those firms' value. Yet, we are using largely the same accounting principles to assess these assets' value. Indeed, we can see a little legacy of these rules in accounting today, as different forms of investment are treated differently. Investments in people receive what I would consider to be the worst quality accounting treatment, as these expenditures are neither capitalized nor disclosed. This creates real problems for valuation of today's public companies, as investors are unable to determine what portion of cash outflows should be considered an investment in the firm's future growth and productivity, and what portion of cash outflows merely allow the firm to maintain its current level of productivity. Second, an increasing number of public companies report a loss for accounting purposes, making analysis of firms' operational costs, the most significant of which is likely to be labor, more important than ever to understanding firm value. In 2020, for the first time, more than half of US-listed companies reported negative earnings. Many of these companies are young, technology-driven firms, and investors are betting on their future profitability. But commonly used valuation techniques, like price-to-earnings ratios, cannot be used to value these firms. Instead, investors must project future earnings, an analysis that requires reliable information about costs, margins, and scalability. But that information is obfuscated under current accounting principles, as investors don't get a sufficiently detailed breakdown of firms' cost structures to identify contribution margins. As I highlighted in my written testimony, that's why our working group proposed 3 recommendations. First, managers should be required to disclose what portion of workforce costs they believe to be an investment in the firm's future growth. Second, workforce costs should be treated in the same way research and development costs are, expensed, but disclosed. That would give investors the information they need to capitalize workforce costs in their own valuation models, should they choose to do so. Finally, the income statement should be disaggregated to give investors more insight into workforce costs. As noted above, investors in loss-making firms need information on costs, margins, and scalability to estimate future profitability. But under current accounting rules, scores of costs are aggregated together under generalized headers, such as cost of goods sold or selling, general, and administrative. Rather than purely generalized categories, investors need detailed information on specific operating costs, the most important of which is labor. Without more detailed cost-level information, it is difficult, if not impossible, to reliably value these firms or to stress test the market's valuation of a firm using fundamental analysis. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify here before you today, and I would be delighted to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much. I will now recognize our next witness, and that is Dr. Rajgopal.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Sherman, Ranking Member Huizenga, Full Committee Chairwoman Waters, and the esteemed members of this subcommittee for inviting me to speak today. It's an honor to be here. My name is Rajgopal, and I'm the Kester and Burns Professor of Accounting and Auditing at Columbia Business School, and was fortunate enough to be on the Ph.D. committee for...
Professor, if you could
Colleen.
speak into the mic and make sure your mic is turned on.
Yes, sorry. So my testimony touches mostly on the E and a bit on the W part of the hearing. In summary, I express support for the SEC's proposed climate risk disclosure rules, but I do have mixed feelings about Scope 3 emissions. I also underscore the need for mandatory disclosure related to compensation, workforce turnover, and tenure for publicly listed US companies. So let's start with the SEC's proposed climate rules related to E. I support the SEC's attempt to mandate rigorous, comparable, consistent data on greenhouse gas emissions across companies. My perspective is informed by a research project where my colleagues and I tried to assess whether the so-called net zero pledges of 57 oil and gas companies are credible. These are just 57 companies, but it took us 6 months to code what these companies were doing. The underlying data is scattered across press releases, websites, 10Ks, sustainability reports. There's tremendous variation in the path followed to a net zero promise, the GHG scope category the promise covered, the reporting framework followed, the verifiability, if any, of the promise path to this net zero idea. Companies routinely follow multiple NGO-sponsored frameworks, such as the TCFD, the GRI, the CDP, and the SASB's frameworks. On top of that, the 4 ESG rating agencies, ISS, Sustainalytics, Bloomberg, and MSCI, provide environmental ratings that don't converge and are all over the map. Without rigor, consistency, comparability, and verifiability of climate risk disclosures, these companies, and I believe, cannot be held accountable for the promises they make to investors in terms of carbon reduction. This concern is even more pressing for the investors of ESG funds that claim to hold publicly listed stocks that are climate friendly. It's also useful to point out that the disclosure framework suggested by the SEC is agnostic with respect to investors' preferences about GHG. Comparable and consistent GHG disclosures can also inform an investor who wants to bet against, not for, the direction of high GHG emitters. If an investor wants to buy stocks with high GHG emissions, so be it. But I do have mixed feelings about the SEC's requirement to disclose Scope 3 data. Consider a case of a publicly listed pizza company that sells prepared pizzas to a retail distributor. The retail distributor then uses delivery services to get the pizza to the customers' homes. Asking the publicly listed pizza company to calculate Scope 3 emissions related to those deliveries can potentially be burdensome. The other conceptual issue to worry about is the significant double counting of emissions if one were to add up all the emissions across companies. So if Chevron sells jet fuel to, say, Delta Airlines for use in a plane made by Boeing, those emissions are Scope 3 for Chevron and Boeing, and Scope 1 for Delta. Hence, these emissions effectively get counted 3 times, which is problematic for any decent accounting system. So every Scope 2 or Scope 3 emission is someone else's Scope 1 emission. But having said that, if a company has promised a Scope 3 reduction to investors, we need disclosures to check whether the promise is actually being met. Let me use the last few minutes I have to touch on and support the petition that Professor Honigsberg and I signed and filed with the SEC. In a typical high school economics class, we teach students that a company creates shareholder value by combining materials, labor, capacity, and some managerial talent. But if you take that high school economics model to a modern day income statement, it's virtually impossible to get answers to any of these questions. We effectively have a 6-line income statement. I don't know where materials are, somewhere in cost of goods sold, but I don't know how much. Labor is everywhere in every line item, except I don't know what the labor costs are. and what the composition across the line items in a financial statement might be. As Chair Sherman mentioned, barely 15% of US companies tell us what labor costs are in their financial statements. So in a sense, the information would help us in 4 concrete ways. Understand intangibles, understand the gains shared between labor and capital, understand substitution of labor for AI, automation, outsourcing, and understand spikes in abnormal turnover. In summary, I support the SEC's climate risk disclosures with qualified enthusiasm for Scope 3 disclosures. I also want to reiterate support for my joint statement with on human capital. Thank you.
Ms. Seegull is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you to the subcommittee for convening today's hearing, and thank you to Committee Chair Waters, Subcommittee Chair Sherman, and Ranking Member Huizenga, and the other esteemed members of this subcommittee for your leadership. Let me start by saying that markets can only exist and operate efficiently when there is a free flow of information, and that is particularly true of our capital markets. It's core to the mission of the SEC to empower investors by engaging and ensuring that they are, when they are assuring they are equipped with clear, comparable, decision-useful data. As the head of an organization representing a wide range of investor perspectives, and as a former chief investment officer, I join you today to share our support for SEC action to create standardized corporate disclosures on human capital management factors. I serve as president of the U.S. Impact Investing Alliance, a nonpartisan organization committed to catalyzing the growth of impact investing, by which we mean investments that create financial returns alongside measurable and positive social, economic, or environmental impact. Members of our boards and councils include institutional investors and individuals collectively owning hundreds of billions of invested assets, in addition to asset and fund managers collectively overseeing more than $1 trillion in assets. Impact investors are motivated by a range of objectives, both financial and values-based. Some impact investors seek to create economic opportunity in historically underinvested communities. Others look to foster the technology and innovation that will drive a sustainable 21st century economy. But what unites all investors is the need for access to corporate information that is material, reliable, and comparable in order to express their individual or institutional priorities and invest their assets accordingly. With that context in mind, I would like to make 5 key points for the subcommittee's consideration. First, the U.S. Impact Investing Alliance and the investors we work with strongly urge the SEC to pursue rulemaking on corporate disclosures for human capital management factors. This should include, among others, the total number of employees by type, the total cost of companies' workforce, turnover rates, and employee diversity demographics at each level of the company. Second, we support these standardized disclosures because a company's workforce is one of its greatest assets, and the success of all companies is dependent on its workers. As such, investors are eager to understand how a company attracts, manages, invests in, and retains its talent, factors that relate directly to business performance. Third, such a rulemaking is clearly consistent with the SEC's mandate to protect investors. Transparency and accountability are the hallmarks of efficient markets, but the current lack of information creates market inefficiencies, harming investors and weakening the financial system. It's in the long-term interest of both individual companies and the wider economy to be responsive in disclosing human capital management factors to investors. Fourth, such disclosures would improve market efficiency and would not impose significant burdens on issuers. Corporate leaders currently navigate a complex web of private disclosure standards in order to meet investor demands. The SEC should standardize these disclosures and thereby create clarity and benefits for issuers, investors, and the broader markets alike. Lastly, SEC action on human capital management disclosure is a matter of American economic leadership and competitiveness. Global regulators are moving forward with their own disclosure frameworks, placing U.S. investors and corporations at an information disadvantage if the U.S. does not pave its own path forward. We believe that clear and consistent disclosure of human capital management factors will make existing U.S. issuers stronger. It will also attract more capital into business and industries that will, in turn, create pathways to economic opportunity for American workers. Collectively, these 5 points show how a streamlined and standardized corporate disclosure framework on human capital management factors from the SEC will fortify the transparency, accountability, and efficiency of our capital markets, and in doing so, enhance the competitiveness of the U.S. economy for many years to come. Thank you to the subcommittee for this opportunity to speak on such an important topic for U.S. investors.
Thank you. Mr. Vollmer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Sherman, Ranking Member Huizenga, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me. My written statement addresses 3 topics and provides some information about my background. In these oral remarks, I'd like to summarize a few main points. As noted in my written statement, my comments are solely my own and are not on behalf of the Mercatus Center or any other person or organization. So the subcommittee is considering the possibility of requiring additional disclosures on workforce management. The question about new areas of disclosure by public companies comes up regularly. When Congress or the SEC is considering the possibility of adding to the already extensive list of disclosures required of reporting companies, it should be guided by a set of basic principles. My written statement lists several principles. For example, Congress or the SEC should impose new disclosure obligations only when it has data or evidence of a strong need or a serious continuing harm that the private markets will not solve and that a law could solve. Congress should evaluate the costs and benefits of possible new disclosure areas. One cost, of course, is compliance. Another cost is that investors, even sophisticated investors, find that disclosure documents under the current system are already long, complicated, and difficult to understand. New disclosure areas with detailed information make the problem worse. A further cost is that new required disclosures restrict personal freedom. Congress should always bear in mind that new laws can reduce liberty. That's a genuine cost to take into account. The bills and proposals for more disclosures in the workforce or human capital management area raise questions under these criteria. In particular, the need for more disclosure is open to doubt. The SEC expanded required human capital disclosures in 2020 and obliged companies to provide additional quantitative and qualitative information. It also deliberately decided not to require extra metrics and statistical information so that each company could discuss the workforce issues relevant to its own business. Additional disclosures in the area would certainly raise costs, especially costs of compliance, but would not necessarily produce benefits greater than those produced by the 2020 SEC rule. My written statement also covers 2 other topics. I encourage the subcommittee to make progress on reforming the statutes and rules on capital formation. Congress could reduce obstacles set up by the public offering process, the complicated set of exemptions from that process, and the lengthy and burdensome set of disclosures reporting companies must make. The final topic I touch on in my written statement concerns the way the current SEC Commission is managing and administering its work. A majority of the Commission has proposed a long list of major rules in quick succession in ways that have disserved the rulemaking process and the public. The accelerated schedule has prevented the SEC staff from adequately developing and preparing draft rules and has denied reasonable amounts of time for the public to comment. That's diminished the quality of the proposed rules and has led to lower staff morale and staff departures. Congress should consider steps to address these problems. Those are the main points in my written statement. I'd be happy to answer questions.
Thank you. I now recognize the gentlewoman from California, the chair of the full committee, for 5 minutes for questioning.
Thank you very much. I want to address this question to Ms. Seegull. According to surveys of public company executives, a majority of the CEOs identified human capital as one of the most valuable assets within their companies. Although many companies have taken the initiative to disclose human capital-related information on their own, including diversity statistics, others have not. Further, there are widespread differences regarding how companies disclose investments in their workforce. For example, firms in the European Union are required to report human capital investments in salaries, bonuses, and other benefits, as well as board diversity information. But because similar disclosures are not required in the United States, only 15% of S&P 500 firms voluntarily do so. According to the Embankment Project for Inclusive Capitalism, however, those U.S. companies that do voluntarily disclose this information outperform those that do not. As your organization interacts with many investors, can you please discuss why workforce or human capital metrics, particularly diversity-related information, is important to investors?
Thank you for the question, Chair Waters. In terms of investor demand among the network of investors that we work with, in June of this year, the U.S. Impact Investing Alliance joined nearly 50 investor and business organizations in writing to SEC Chair Gensler, encouraging the agency to prioritize standardized disclosures on human capital management specifically, and that includes diversity data, which is worth noting is already collected by companies in their EEO-1 data. So I think what we're asking here on diversity in particular is the disclosure of data that is already being disclosed. I was reading and enjoying a Harvard Law School and IARS Institute report on materiality that specifically talks about human capital disclosure. It effectively is a meta-study of 92 empirical studies that examine the relationship between HR policies and financial outcomes, and including return on equity, return on investment, and profit margins. And it concluded, this meta-study effectively concluded that there's sufficient evidence of human capital materiality to financial performance to warrant inclusion in standard investment analysis. Specifically, as it relates to diversity across corporate boards, senior management, and overall workforce, we know, according to studies, that diversity corresponds with better financial performance and resiliency, as well as a company's ability to attract and retain talent. So, I will also mention on the diversity piece, the investors that we work with disclose workforce disclosure by race, gender, LGBTQ+, and disability status, so that investors can understand the diversity and the strength of workforce as a way of assessing a company's strength and allocating capital thereof.
Thank you very much. I have a little time left, and I'd like to direct this question to Professor Rajgopal. As you know, SEC's proposed disclosure rule applies only to publicly listed companies. Would you comment on the benefits of extending these disclosure requirements to similarly situated but privately held operating companies that issue unregistered securities or operating companies that are wholly substantially owned by private equity funds such as Staples, which is owned by Sycamore Partners, and PetSmart, which is owned by BC Partners?
Thank you, Congressman. So part of the problem with this ESG disclosure idea is that if you mandate something for the publicly listed companies, there's always a possibility of transparency arbitrage. So, if the rules become harder for public companies, you create incentives for these people to go private. And then the exact problem that you were trying to solve in the public space now just migrates to a different area. So one has to be careful about this information arbitrage idea, and this has been going on in other domains for a long time. So that's my concern.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, and I recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And Mr. Vollmer, is it correct to, is it a correct assertion that any of the workforce management or diversity data items being considered here today would already have been disclosed if they were material to investors?
I think that's true since the 2020 SEC expansion of the rule.
Okay. And has the materiality standard, which has been the recognized standard for decades, served American investors well?
It's served American investors extremely well.
Okay, is there a good reason to deviate from that standard as each of these bills do?
I think a materiality qualifier needs to be included in any additional disclosures that Congress adopts or the SEC adopts.
Just a short little while ago, Ms. Seegull actually, and I wrote this down, was talking about workforce disclosures, and she said, really, what we're asking is, quote, the disclosure of data that is already disclosed. That didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Other than maybe mandating it in a certain form through the SEC, and obviously there's costs when you're forcing companies to disclose information that's not material to investors, correct?
The costs can be extremely high. If you go back to the very beginning when Justice Marshall adopted the materiality standard for proxy statements in a case called TSC, he warned that a corporation and its management could be subject to liability for insignificant statements or misstatements, and that shareholders could be buried in an avalanche of trivial information.
Yeah. Well, in an expansion of that, lately we've seen some Democrat SEC commissioners call for ESG disclosure mandates on private companies in their speeches. And the climate disclosure proposal would impose disclosure requirements indirectly on private companies through the Scope 3 requirements. Professor Rajgopal had mentioned a pizza delivery. Well, I've got Gerber Baby Food in my district, all right, owned by Nestle, a publicly traded company. So you are now going to go and effectively require family-owned small farms that supply the peas, the carrots, and the corn that get steamed and put in a jar to now do a Scope 3 disclosure. And as I talked to one of the farmers, he said, I'm the guy that does all the reports. They're struggling to make sure they hit the organic versus the non-organic, much less having a compliance department. There is none. So there is completely unworkable, as has been discussed. But a lot of these ESG mandates that are being discussed are publicly traded because that's who the SEC regulates. But wouldn't these both direct, much less these indirect disclosure requirements on privately held companies be concerning to you as well?
I think trying to impose some of these broad and extensive disclosure obligations on private companies would be extremely unwise. Not only would you deter people from using the securities system to raise capital, but you're talking about a group of investors for private companies that are extremely sophisticated and know what information they need to make investment decisions. That's how the system operates at the moment.
Yeah.
There's really no need to require large sets of additional disclosures.
They are sophisticated investors apparently until it comes to FTX, but that's another hearing that's going to be coming up. So I do, and I question, frankly, whether it's legal. How do you have the legal ability to go in and force a privately held company to do these types of disclosures that are not materia and those kinds of things? I do want to also quickly touch on, in my last remaining seconds here, Professor Honigsberg, you had talked about what I viewed as accounting principles. That's very different than SEC mandated disclosures. And as we were chatting up here, I mean, I think that's an area that we can and should discuss. But a 10K or a 10Q is very different than having the SEC come in on an ESG mandate. But there is, we ultimately need to know how these mandates help shareholders and how we make sure that we don't add additional regulatory burdens on those returns, thus harming both mom and pop investors as well as those institutional investors. My time has expired, but I yield back.
Thank you. I would like to comment that I believe our ranking member is more woke than he may realize. He tells us that the W for today's hearing is for woke, and the W for today's hearing is providing workforce metrics. So if it's woke to want workforce metrics, an investor tries to evaluate a company, we here have to evaluate the SEC. The gentleman does that, and he focused on turnover and attrition at the SEC. So if he uses workforce metrics to evaluate entities that he has to evaluate, why shouldn't investors have workforce metrics to evaluate companies? And if it is woke to care about workforce attrition, then I think that, yes.
If the gentleman yield, I'm just trying to fit in. So
Good. And the fact is that workforce is material to investors. My fear as an old accountant is that we are doing a great job of reporting a tiny portion of the information that's needed. As the witnesses have pointed out, back in 75 and before, and keep in mind, the balance sheet, the income statement, what we disclose, is 100 years old. Back then, even in 75, 90% of the value of the company was the stuff that's on the balance sheet today. Now it's 20% or less of the value of the company is what's the balance sheet today. We need a supplemental statement. Mr. Vollmer tells us that investors have perhaps are overwhelmed by too much information, but obviously workforce metrics ought to be included. And if you watch CNBC, you see that investors want more information. They're watching it 24 hours. The ranking member is concerned about our power to require disclosures from public companies. I'd say we clearly have that power under the Commerce Clause. And I'd point out that we ought to provide, that when we're talking about large companies, we ought to require such disclosures just to keep things even between the companies investors are allowed to invest in and the ones that are private and they can't invest in. Ms. Allen-Ratzlaff, studies have shown that, and these studies are impressive at least to some investors, that companies make better decisions when their decision-making group is diverse. Should we disclose the diversity of the board, the executive group, or the diversity of, say, the top 5% in compensation at a company?
Thank you, Chair Sherman, for that question. Looking at the totality of disclosures that we have currently today, when you're talking about, for example, board diversity, that's something that right now some companies disclose, some do not, but investors certainly are looking for that information. And right now, what we have is a situation where investors essentially are guesstimating more or less the diversity of boards, even though, to your point, there is research showing time and time again that diverse boards, and I would say diversity across the board, are better at making decisions. They create more value for shareholders, period. I mean, that's what shareholders care about. And I would also point out, we were talking about the SK rules, which went into effect in November 2020, and Just Capital's data shows that 32% of companies at the beginning of 2021 disclosed some type of demographic data. As of September 20.
I'm going to interrupt because
sorry.
I've got limited time.
Yep.
But yes, all these companies are telling us things, but without universally accepted definitions, tabular displays, internal control, auditing, they're just doing it on their own. And I would point out, Mr. Vollmer says that accounting standards diminish liberty. We don't give companies the liberty to decide what's on the balance sheet. We tell them at the FASB, and we should have standards for disclosing other information. I want to thank Professor Rajgopal for pointing out some of the accounting difficulties of dealing with Scope 3. I know a lot of environmentalists. I'm always the only accountant in the room, and they don't know how tough it is. I want to thank one of the witnesses for pointing out that if we in the U.S. don't provide information that at least some investors want, we lose out to other investment markets. And finally, I want to point out that the SEC has been badgered in this room for the 26 years I've been here for not getting their job done. Thank God, they're working hard, they're getting their job done. And I will now recognize Ms. Wagner.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have been, along with many others, very troubled that the SEC is deviating from its core mission of protecting investors and facilitating capital formation. It's as simple as that. In fact, I, too, sent a letter last Monday to Chair Gensler expressing my concerns with this proposed rule to reform U.S. equity market structures. This soon-to-be proposed rule appears to have been hastily developed without any empirical evidence that there is a problem with the current quality of U.S. equity markets for retail investors. At a time when our equity markets remain the deepest, the most liquid in the world, and provide retail investors with historically high access to low-cost investment opportunities, the SEC's recommendations will have a negative consequences on millions of mom-and-pop retail investors working to simply secure their financial future. And I'd like to enter, Mr. Chairman, this letter into the record. And I
Without objection, so ordered.
look so forward to finally questioning Chair Gensler on this matter next Congress. It is long overdue. I am further concerned that the SEC is attempting to implement a partisan policy agenda through additional government mandates. Mr. Vollmer, you touched on this some, but would requiring the SEC to establish mandatory disclosures on issues outside of its expertise and its mission, such as the proposals before us, resulting in a complicated and confusing disclosure regime for investors and businesses?
Yes, it already has, and it will continue to do so if they continue on the same path.
In your opinion, is the SEC the appropriate entity for determining reporting metrics and industry standards when it comes to workforce management and diversity?
I'm not aware that they have that kind of expertise. In particular, I think that some of the bills and the proposals would require very detailed disclosures in many different areas where I'm quite sure the SEC lacks the expertise. But certainly there are some employee and workforce areas where the SEC is competent.
Does piling on additional disclosure requirements help increase capital formation and encourage companies to go public?
Oh, I think there's a major concern with raising the costs of compliance with the disclosures that the SEC administers. It deters companies from going public.
Yes, it does.
And that deprives lots of retail investors of opportunities because the private market offerings exclude a great many retail investors.
And this is a huge problem currently.
I agree.
Mr. Vollmer, can you describe to us how the SEC lacks statutory authority to adopt the rules in its climate disclosure proposal?
I would be delighted, but I don't think you have enough time. I wrote 2 separate submissions and filed them with the SEC about their proposed climate change rules. The first one is a rather lengthy legal analysis of their lack of statutory authority. And the core of the point is if you go back to 1933, which was the Securities Act of 1933, set the disclosure framework that has remained in place. It focuses on certain subjects, and those subjects all relate to the valuation of the company. Financial performance, financial statements, the business, what securities are being offered, and Congress was very precise about these different categories of information. And that approach has carried forward to today, and the SEC is not permitted to vary it without Congress's consent. Congress has not authorized.
And what kind of precedent, regulatory precedent, would that set for the SEC and other federal agencies if it would do so?
Well, we've already seen that the courts are very concerned about agencies exceeding their statutory boundaries, because then you have regulation by a very small group of unelected people rather than having policies set by this Congress.
Unelected bureaucrats. I thank you for your testimony. I'm out of time and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster, is also the chair of the Task Force on Artificial Intelligence, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
And thank you, Mr. Chair. Our first 2 witnesses commented on the 90% fraction of intangibles in the valuation of companies. You know, to me, this raises questions or worries about whether there may be a valuation bubble that may at some point be on the verge of systemic collapse. Perhaps triggering a financial crisis if it's 90% of valuations. I think it was back roughly in 2018 that a paper came out of UC London called Capitalism Without Capital that got play in The Economist magazine and elsewhere. And it described the sudden collapse of an English construction firm, I think called Carillon, which had 40,000 employees, but apparently badly mispriced, in very few tangible assets and very badly mispriced intangibles. And a recent example of what might trigger this sort of collapse is this incredible recent breakthroughs in GPT chatbots, which you may be aware of, where these look like they are very close to being able to replace, computer coders, Harvard lawyers, and a wide range of people that spend their days staring at screens can be. And so this would immediately cause a massive revaluation of the human capital part of the valuation of firms. There are thoughtful commentators looking at the performance of these that thinks within a couple of years, Google is going to be obsolete. That instead of searching the internet, you will simply ask your chatbot to summarize the total content available on the internet, and it will give you a nicely formatted, concise summary of what you want to know. And this will immediately, Google has all sorts of intellectual property and intangibles, and a great workforce around its search business will be vaporized. And so, how do you view this, and how worried should we be in financial services about the potentially volatile nature of the valuation of human capital as AI accelerates its disruption of the workforce? I guess, John, go through in order that you were called, since you both mentioned the 90%.
Sure. Thank you so much for that question. I think we absolutely should be concerned. I think the 90% is huge. And the SEC, their job is to make sure that investors have the information they need to make decisions and get out of the way. That there's nothing more free market than that. And investors have been raising the same issues that you have, that simply we have no idea how well companies are managing their workforce. It's interesting. I know several years ago there was a rule adopted by the SEC on CEO to worker pay ratio, and regardless of your personal or political views across the board on that, we actually looked through a few of the disclosures, and in 2 hours, we found 14 companies that said that they actually have no idea and they cannot tell you what they spend on their workforce. Labor cost is a basic part of the income statement on which every single financial statement is based. So that means income statement, if there's something wrong with that, same with the balance sheet.
Before I go on to the next witness, do you have trouble untangling the cause and effect between profitable companies and companies that treat their workforce well? Because you can imagine that a company with a good line of products is very profitable and is in a position to treat its workers well, whereas one that is forcing external competition simply may not be able to. And this is, how do you deal with that? I'm getting nods from our second witness, so if you could try to answer both of those.
So, Congressman, those are both great questions. And I think, consistent with my colleague here, I would say this is all the more reason why we need to provide this type of information. So, for example, there's a recent study that I think is relevant to your second question. And this study looked at both capital expenditures and labor cost as a percentage of sales over the period from 1991 to 2018. They found that capital expenditures as a percentage of sales remained roughly constant at about 10%. Whereas labor expenses as a percentage of sales increased from about 28% to close to 50%. Now, this was done with European data, so we wouldn't be able to run this type of study in the US. But presumably, we would have a similar trend here. And so for us, I think we really want to be able to identify this information. How much are they spending on human capital? If we see erosion because of AI, we would see that number actually being able to decrease in a way that we can see with European data, but that we wouldn't be able to see right now using our US data.
Yeah, thank you. And if any of you have a reading list for a member of Congress, it's sort of at the level of the UC London paper, and that you can reply for the record, I'd much appreciate it. Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you. Now recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for everyone being here. Greatly appreciate you being here, but I think you've heard from us before. We really feel the panel would be rounded out with Chairman Gensler here, since he's driving an awful lot of this, or attempting to. We're thankful, or at least I am, that not every sector of the government was able to get someone in place, so I'm glad that Sarah Bloom Raskin's not at the Federal Reserve. I hope the Federal Reserve stays focused on its own lane. But this whole idea of ESG dominating our capital markets instead of fiduciary duty, I think is rightly troubling. I've had constituents frustrated because they feel like their pension fund isn't pursuing the best returns. I've had financial advisors frustrated, and I've just had ordinary people in business say, why are my bigger customers pushing us to do these things for disclosures, net of mandates from capital markets? So people want to run the business that they built, and if you look at say the most alarmist predictions on sea level rise or something like that, the idea that you couldn't possibly make a loan that's for 5 years and understand the risk of default is hard for people to comprehend. So, Mr. Vollmer, when you look at fiduciary duty, has there been a statutory change that we all missed somehow, that somehow says, no, ESG is now more important than a fiduciary duty?
No, there's not been a change, and I think the foremost consideration of both fiduciaries, asset managers, but also corporate boards is to produce the maximum returns for shareholders.
Yeah, and there's, as has been discussed already, a materiality standard there, which could include some other impacts. But in your testimony, you discuss the accelerated rulemaking agenda within the SEC, which has led to all kinds of problems there and problems potentially for our capital markets. In light of West Virginia versus EPA, there are also clearly problems for the fact that it's not legal. Do you believe that an agency with the kind of morale, staff retention, and leadership problems that the SEC has under Gary Gensler adequately promotes, capital markets in our country?
I think that we need to return much more attention to capital formation and capital access.
Yeah, almost like we could focus on the mission, not necessarily this other agenda. Really appreciate that. I think that's a sentiment broadly shared, but troubling that it's not shared by most of the positions that the Biden administration's appointed. I think one of the important things is the Biden administration's appointed people whose mean years of private sector experience is 0. The median years is 0. They're all academia, thought leaders down this movement. And so speaking of that, Ms. Honigsberg, earlier this year you participated in a podcast with Joe Bankman, your colleague at Stanford Law and the father of Sam Bankman-Fried, the now disgraced and former CEO of FTX. In that podcast, you spent time with Mr. Bankman trying to outline the importance of ESG reporting requirements, and you even discuss an example where a small group of investors were able to force a vote on ExxonMobil to push for cleaner energy. Speaking of Exxon and FTX, the FTX case poses some interesting ESG questions. An analysis by TrueView Labs gave FTX a higher ESG rating than Exxon. As you know, it was largely due to Mr. Bankman-Fried's approach to what he claimed was, quote, effective altruism, perhaps like Robin Hood. I don't know. I don't know what his logic was. But Ms. Honigsberg, do you really feel that a higher rating for a company like FTX is more merited than Exxon? And if not, what's this ESG metric missing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And first and foremost, I really hope all the victims of FTX get the fullest extent of justice that they can get under the law. I think we all think that. And, in hindsight, clearly it doesn't make sense that a crypto company would have a higher rating than, many other companies. I think my understanding of the issue with that was that Exxon was largely unreceptive to feedback and consideration, and it also comes down to how we measure ESG, which is terrible. And so, for example, Professor Rajgopal and I went through 4 different issuers, and we found that those 4 different issuers disclosed 70 different metrics just on human capital alone. Only one of them was disclosed in common. You just don't have the information to where you can evaluate, and companies are able to cherry pick.
Yeah, I agree that the way you're doing ESG is terrible, so thank you.
I look forward to next year when I'm sure the then majority will have Mr. Gensler here. It'll make my life more interesting, and it'll boost our ratings on C-SPAN 3. I now recognize Mr. Vargas from California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. I want to thank Chairwoman Waters. Of course, you as chair and the ranking member for this hearing. I think it's very, very important. Before I get into my prepared remarks, I do want to ask Ms. Seegull, you were quoted, and I think correctly, disclose information that is already disclosed. Within the context of what you were saying, I thought what you meant to say was information that is already collected, but maybe it wasn't. I do want to give you a few seconds to clarify that. Go ahead.
Thank you, Congressman Vargas. Yes, I apologize if I misspoke. What I meant to say, if I didn't say it, is that EEO-1 data on workforce diversity is already collected by large companies, but not disclosed currently to investors. So my point was, 1, that it should be disclosed to investors, and 2, because the information is already being collected, it would not impose significant additional cost on issuers to disclose this vital information to investors.
Thank you. That's what I understood within. I think you misspoke. It's funny, if you were 80 years old, they would say you were senile because that's what the other side says about the president. But obviously, you're incredibly intelligent, and you just misspoke a word, and that happens all the time. But again, if unfairness sometimes, You should have been given the courtesy to correct that, and I'm glad you did correct that. With that being said, I know this hearing is focused on workforce management, but I'd like to look at the totality of ESG-related disclosures. ESG disclosures are market-driven initiative to increase investor education and corporate transparency. Information from ESG disclosures help investors gain greater insight into what companies are doing to reduce their carbon footprint and address the important issues like climate change, diversity, and labor rights, which I do think are material. Investors understand that ESG issues are material and need to be accounted for when assessing market opportunities and risks. In market economies, this is called complete information, when investors have all the needed metrics to make well-informed, ethical, and sustainable financial decisions. As a matter of fact, the data shows, and today we heard testimony, that corporations that implement sustainability strategies, have experienced better financial information such as more innovation, higher operational efficiency, and better risk management. Additionally, a recent Ernst & Young survey states that a majority of companies saw higher than expected financial gains from their ESG initiatives. And companies that incorporate financial metrics, employee well-being, and customer benefits in the holistic ESG programs saw increased environmental gains as well. So just to be clear, it is profitable to be in the business of sustainability, stewardship, environment, diversifying the boardroom, limiting corruption, and taking care of your workers. These factors materially impact companies' performance, communities, and the lives of our constituents. And I applaud Chairman Gensler and the SEC for their proposed ESG disclosure. And additionally, I'm proud to announce that next year I will be working on the Congressional Sustainable Investment Caucus. I look forward to working with Chair Waters, my colleagues, hopefully on a bipartisan basis to highlight the role ESG plays in our economy. 10 years ago when I got elected, my good friends on the other side, and I do have some very good friends on the other side, I shouldn't be beating them up so much, but they were all about beating up Dodd-Frank. Then when the CEOs of the banking industry came, they said Dodd-Frank was actually very helpful. Then when we heard from the academics, they said that Dodd-Frank was very helpful, especially the capital standard. So they don't beat up on them anymore. Then they used to beat up on the SEC, saying they were too hard on crypto. In fact, it's kind of interesting. I saw a little bit of a backsliding here today because they said, why do they have to have so much disclosures? Well, now we see why they should have more disclosures. But anyway, all that being said, I do want to ask Professor Ratzlaff, do you believe that ESG is material information?
Thank you so much, and I'd love to say that I'm a professor, but I'm not. But I do believe that that factors that are that might be considered ESG, the definition's a little bit difficult, are already being taken into account by investors. And I also like to state that materiality is not necessarily a requirement. I know I've heard that from colleagues many times on this panel, but it's simply not the case. If we used a materiality standard, we never know about executive compensation, for example. There are materiality standards that are based on a certain percentage of revenue. There are standards that are based off of just information that investors have been saying are important. So I just wanted to be very, very clear that investors are looking for this data. And to your point, you mentioned FTX. We all saw the leaked picture of their income statement, and what we don't want to see is, I'm not sure if this is accurate or not.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Arkansas for 5 minutes.
Hey, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the panel. Very informed, smart, good panel, helpful to the committee's operation. And you know, like all laws, there are good things and bad things in those laws. And so there are plenty of things that House Republicans still object to that were contained in Dodd-Frank and can go into those in great detail, but we're not going to do that today. Professor Rajgopal, I thought you made a really good, thoughtful statement about information arbitrage, which is a classic in economics, and the Ph.D. in accounting even learns about it, so that you have this perverse incentive of raising agency costs and sending people from the public markets to the private markets. But also there's the issue of building up a cost structure that's so high that even if one's objective to be a public enterprise is still, number one, you're raising the market cap to justify going public, reducing capital choice to small and mid-sized and emerging growth companies, which is why this Congress and this committee on a bipartisan basis has passed 2 versions of the Jobs Act in order to drop those agency costs and those burdens. So in this debate about whether it's the E in ESG or the S, a lot of this is about doing it in the right way rather than the wrong way to diminish agency costs and not deter capital formation. So there's no use in here of people calling people names about climate denier, blah, blah, blah. So I'd ask you, I want to thank you for that comment. I thought it was helpful. Have you read the 2017 so-called Mark Carney Bloomberg Commission Task Force on Climate Disclosure?
It's a long document. I recall.
It is a long document. And in that, it requires that those disclosures be timely, accurate, comparable within industries, measurable across industries, not too costly. It has a whole list of things that they say, and then they end up saying, while these are great goals, it's going to be very hard to do this. And in fact, they say don't do Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3. They have a whole metric in that 2017 report suggesting a different emissions type definition for carbon. So I think that's why we're not skeptics about doing disclosure. We want to do it in the right way, in the least costly way that brings the most benefit. So let me stop there, and again, thank you for your comment. And Dr. Honigsberg, excellent comments. I share those with the ranking member about accounting standards, and would love to get a memo from you on a gap memo that addresses workforce-related issues that I assume, do you know that if GAP or FASB is entertaining working on that? And it has really, I don't want to say it has nothing to do with this committee, but it isn't a KQ disclosure per se, and we were both intrigued by that. So what is the working group zone out in FASB land on that topic?
So first, I would be delighted to work with your staff on any of these issues.
Yep.
Now, we have had conversations with FASB about this. My understanding is that they are more focused and are actually considering income statement disaggregation.
Okay.
So they would look at, for example, breaking out cost of goods sold into what portion is labor, what portion of other elements, but that, it's FASB. They have a relatively slow timeline.
Yes, they do.
Yeah, so I believe.
We remember when it was just a suggestion.
Exactly. So to the degree that we can help them better, focus on what would be helpful in valuation, I think would be great.
Well, thank you. I think in academics and also in the coalition type work, this is not a one-size-fits-all topic on any way, stretch, or form. And Mr. Vollmer, you've made that point. And so for industry groups, making industry recommendations to standard setters is the way to go. It shouldn't be mandated by Congress. It shouldn't be mandated by Gary Gensler. It really shouldn't. That's not the way over the years we've developed this. So, Mr. Vollmer, you were the Deputy General Counsel at the SEC when Chair Clayton created this principles-based approach on Reg SK, basing it on material information. In your view, has there been a demonstrated need or market failure that necessitates a more prescriptive approach to this topic?
I think that the SEC's new rule in 2020, which tried to balance some enhanced disclosures, including quantitative disclosures, but with flexibility, was reasonable, and we ought to give it some time to work.
Because people are now studying that. I just read an Aon study. I'd like to insert that in the record, Mr. Chairman, if I could, the Aon study comparing the first 2 years.
The time of the gentleman.
I have a motion. I'm asking for your permission to insert in the record Aon study on the.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, and I yield back, and I appreciate the time.
Thank you. A vote has been called. We will adjourn this hearing when 300 of our colleagues have completed voting. And I will now recognize Mr. Kasten for 5 minutes and note that he is the vice chair of this subcommittee.
I will try.
And I also want to note that we do have jurisdiction in this subcommittee over FASB and PCAOB.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will try not to talk for 300 votes. So just a couple, and I want to focus on the E part of ESG. 2020 CFTC report said that climate change poses a major risk to the stability of our financial system. 2021, FSOC said basically the same thing. The IPCC has recently said that if we stay on the current trajectory, losses from climate change could approach $23 trillion per year. I see you nodding, Mr. Rajgopal. That risk or any risk, if I'm an investor and I'm concerned about that risk, I'd like to know, number one, who's contributing to the risk. Number two, how do I hedge the risk? Number two, three, who's most exposed to the risk and move my capital around appropriately. Now, I think your answer is going to be yes. If you say no, I'm going to have to pivot to a friendlier witness. But in general, Mr. Rajgopal, do you agree that provided they have sufficient information, that markets are actually a very efficient way to allocate risk?
Absolutely.
Okay, good. We can move on then. Going to who is the hedge against that risk, and I was just sitting here Googling on my phone as of the close of last week. First Solar is trading at a price-earnings ratio of 189. NextEra is trading at a price-earnings ratio of 30. Tesla, as much as their CEO is going crazy right now and tanking their stock, is still trading at a price-earnings ratio of 55. ExxonMobil is trading at 8. Chevron's trading at 10. Given our agreement about capital markets, would you say that capital markets are efficiently allocating market capital in response to hedging out these climate risks, or are they just woke?
So my read of Exxon is probably similar to yours, in the sense that maybe they see that in the future, eventually, for all kinds of reasons, the demand for oil, especially from transportation, will maybe stabilize, if not peter off eventually. And maybe that's what the markets are looking at.
Yeah, and I'm not asking to opine, but we're actually seeing movements of capital, which is positive, right? But I mean, look, every time we've seen an industry transition, some companies have pivoted and adapted, and some have whined. And we know what happens when the markets pivot. Now, I put this caveat on the front of if we have complete information. And this is all about markets moving to hedge the risk and look at where it goes. When we look at the losses from climate change, do you think we have sufficiently transparent information now to make sure that investors can rationally allocate their capital?
Absolutely not.
Neither do I. And I ask that because this at core to me is about financial stability. It's not about wokeness. It's about if we don't have the information, of course, there isn't an industry in the world that has ever come to Washington and said, dear members of Congress, would you please make our industry more competitive and efficient? It never happens. So it's understandable that they're saying, please don't be woke. Please don't stop our capital from going through. But meanwhile, these losses are coming. There's a recent study, and I'm just picking on one state, and I'm intentionally picking a state that we don't think about in terms of flooding. We've got sea level rise, we've got losses. West Virginia, not a state that you think about as a super flood prone risk. First Street Foundation recently estimated that more than 400,000 properties in West Virginia are at risk of being severely flooded in the next 30 years, which represents more than 1/3 of all of the properties in the state. If I am an insurer, a mortgage provider, someone who's holding the residual equity in those, do you think I actually have enough information to understand and to hedge that risk right now?
So are you asking me about investors have the information or do the insurer have the information?
Well, let me maybe reframe. If there is a lack of complete information, and we had this conversation a few months ago with Jay Powell when I talked about flood risk, and I said, do you think the sophisticated players will spot this sooner and offload the risk onto the unsophisticated players? And he said, yeah, that's probably, I'm paraphrasing him, that would probably happen. That's a risk, I think, to the stability of the financial system. So do you see risks to the stability of the financial system if we don't get this transparency of information? And we could talk about floods, we could talk about fires, we could talk about any number of climate risks. Do we have complete information? If we don't, is there a stability problem there?
So let me, in 30 seconds, try to do the best I can with that question. That's a very complicated question. In my view, insurers, especially the PNC insurers, write one-year policies. So they have to worry about risk for 1 year. If you're an equity investor in an insurance company, you probably have a longer horizon. So they're completely different problems.
Of course.
Unlike, say, a life insurance policy, where I have to forecast whether the person I'm writing the policy on will live for 20 years or 30 years or 40 years. It's the fundamentally different nature of contracts for life insurance and PNC, which makes this quite hard.
Of Quite agree. And the CFTC report I mentioned actually observed that they saw an offloading of risk onto Fannie and Freddie in flood-prone areas. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Professor Honigsberg, I was hoping to follow this up with you. If you'd like follow up offline, we'd love to connect with you, but thank you, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from Illinois. Recognize, I'll point out that some 368 have not voted yet, so we do have enough time. We look forward to hearing the questions of the gentleman from West Virginia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There has never been an administration more hostile to the fossil fuel industry and, by extension, my beloved state of West Virginia, than the Biden administration. When the Obama-Biden war on fossil fuels began in 2009, coal mining employed nearly 28,000 West Virginians. Today, that number has shrunk to half, about 14,000. And just last month, President Biden said, referencing coal, that, quote, "We're going to be shutting these plants down all across America," close quotes. President Biden is putting West Virginians out of work and suffocating our economy. Biden and his allies here in Congress have not been able to pass many of their climate priorities in Congress through the democratic process. Instead, Biden is turning to his financial regulators to abuse their authorities and bypass Congress to enact them on his behalf. Despite businesses and these job-creating businesses that are important in my state and all across the country saying it would be costly and unworkable, the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, is pushing forward with a rule to require public companies to disclose all of their emissions, including from their upstream and downstream suppliers. So my questions for Mr. Vollmer: how is information about climate emissions actually material to an investor's investment decisions? In other words, is this just a way to name and shame fossil fuel companies?
It's difficult to answer that question generally because climate change information covers such a broad range. But I think the better way to think about this, and the short version of the answer is, there are already extensive required disclosures in the federal securities laws. They go on for pages in the Code of Federal Regulations, and they cover all aspects of the financial performance and operations and business of reporting companies. And they touch on all the matters that would be relevant or important to investors. So there's no need for a whole separate second set of disclosures aimed at climate change risks.
Thank you. Well put. Follow-up to that, activists contend that ESG and environmental, social, and governance investing is somehow the morally responsible and more profitable thing to do. So, Mr. Vollmer, how do the returns for the families who invest in ESG funds compare to non-ESG funds?
Well, I'm not current with all the recent research, but the last time I looked at it, it's a highly controversial and debatable point. The evidence is mixed, and it often depends on how the questions are asked, how the studies are done. So I think we need to be careful of people who assert that extensive disclosures in these various areas produce benefits for investors, or tell us more about the returns of some of the reporting companies, because I'm not sure that in the end that's really solid.
Okay, thank you. Well, I just want to state that, under the strong leadership of our state treasurer in West Virginia, Riley Moore, we've led the way in divesting from asset managers who focus on appeasing woke activists rather than maximizing returns for American families and retirees who depend on these returns to pay their bills, their mortgages, their children's colleges, put food on the table. State treasurers have a fiduciary responsibility to maximize returns on investments. At a time when the number of companies going public has dropped dramatically, the SEC and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle here, the Democrats, would be wise to focus on actions that encourage business growth rather than pushing for irresponsible environmental policies. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. I want to thank the 320 members of the Congress who have not voted yet, because they give me an opportunity to recognize the gentleman from New Jersey for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman. I'm also grateful. Thank you today for all of our witnesses for being here. A recent scandal uncovered that Sustainalytics, the ESG research subsidiary of Morningstar, has published ESG ratings of companies based on information from the biased United Nations Human Rights Council that has long promoted anti-Semitism, undermined U.S. allies, including Israel and Taiwan, and selectively ignored human rights abuses around the world. Just this past October, the biased council refused to even debate the treatment of the Uyghurs population in China. Americans choosing to invest in ESG-focused financial products expect firms to provide unbiased and relevant data about how their money is supporting specific ESG goals. Morningstar's use of the biased United Nations data is completely unacceptable. Ms. Allen-Ratzlaff, if I can ask you a question, please. Sure. Does Just Capital use the United Nations biased human rights councils as a source for human rights-related ratings?
Not to my knowledge, no. Our ratings, and I should say that their relative rankings are based solely on what we hear from the American people are their priorities.
Well, good. Sounds like that's a no. I'm happy to hear that. Do you feel it's appropriate for ESG ratings firms to use potentially biased information from international organizations to develop their scores?
You know, I actually think that you point to an important problem and issue within ESG in and of itself, is that there's no definition for it. We know that E stands for environment, S stands for social, and G stands for governance, and that's about it. So, it's certainly, you know, that's a private company that has decided to use certain metrics. We don't, you know, again, we use a relative ranking. I wouldn't view us, Just Capital, as a rating firm. I would view us as, you know, looking at how well companies satisfy the expectations of American workers, and again, that translates into value.
Right, but you gotta be careful, right? Because it could be misleading to investors.
Actually, yes. Yes, that's without any definition. Yes, absolutely, and I think that's why 90% of Americans, including 86% of Republicans, 98% of Democrats, and 88% of Independents say it's important that there are common, standardized reporting structures for companies. I think what we're seeing right now is that we start with the free market. That's great. But right now, we're just not getting high quality information. And I'd push back a little bit on the idea that what we are looking at right now is not of use to investors. It absolutely is. And to make sure that we're able to create value for example, a beneficiary at a pension fund, by telling that pension fund, I'm sorry, you can't consider factors that you would have considered 30 years ago to understand how well, for example, your companies that you have bought debt from are able to pay back that debt. It concerns me. So, yep.
Thank you. Ms. Seegull, in your work with impact investors, how do you help them evaluate ESG research to ensure that their decisions are not inadvertently supporting outside efforts like the anti-Semitic boycott, divestment, and sanctions or BDS movement, which the U.S. Congress has overwhelmingly condemned, or other efforts that can undermine our allies?
Mm-hmm. So Cambria and others have brought up the rating agencies and the methodologies that these rating agencies use. The data comes from sustainability reports that are voluntarily offered with the data points cherry-picked. And so what we have in these ratings is publicly available information, unverified, cherry-picked. And so what we encourage our investors to do is to take ratings under advisement, to look at underlying methodology, and to do their own primary research. The problem is that without standardized, comparable data that I think we're all calling for from the SEC on material ESG factors, we're reliant on these imperfect metrics.
Right, and
these metrics can be, that you talked about.
No, these metrics can be misleading, right, and mislead investors and actually get them to support things that are counter to their values. That's my concern. And I yield back. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I have a letter to submit for the record that was sent to Chair Waters and Ranking Member McHenry from the Small Business Investor Alliance concerning the negative impact increased disclosures could have on small businesses.
Without objection, it will be entered into the record. I want to thank our witnesses to come before us today, and again for changing their schedule so they could be here today, even though we were going to do this 2 days ago. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will then be forwarded to the witnesses for the response. I ask the witnesses to please respond as promptly as they are able. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous material to the chair for inclusion in the record. I remind members that written questions and materials for the record should be submitted to the email address provided to your offices. The hearing is adjourned.